Before I start, I just want to bring your attention to this, which took me 7 years to publish. So I think most of you are probably aware that finally the baby monitor study did get published. It was very difficult, and I've learned enormous amount doing this PhD, and in particular, the conflict of interest by journal reviewers who are not required to disclose their conflict of interest, and the industry influence on journals in electromagnetic field research is quite profound. And I always knew it, but to actually go through the process was a different kettle of fish. So does radio frequency radiation impact sleep? Finally was published. It's statistically significant. Essentially what I'm saying is that don't have Wi-Fi in your bedroom. I would say the whole house, but I wasn't allowed to say that. But essentially, so it's had 2,200 views in 5 weeks. So it's getting traction out there without any publicity, which is good. And it really validates what you're doing is so important, especially because we know people with mold sensitivities often become electrically sensitive, often become chemically sensitive. So you really can't truly help a lot of these clients unless you're dealing with, EMFs, mold, and the chemical sensitivities. And that's becoming more and more evident in the research and conversations I'm having with researchers in this particular space. So that is just saying, here's actual data, randomized controlled trial, that's showing that having Wi-Fi in your bedroom actually causes sleep dysfunction in non-REM, theta and gamma waves, as well as both subjective and objective findings. So there were double parameters that were showing that it's actually potentially a real case scenario. So, or, it was ironic in the last 20 years of doing house calls and stuff and seeing people with insomnia sleeping near meter panels and high levels of electromagnetic fields, to actually test that and go through ethics and go through clinical trials and, actually do the study, etc. And then holding my breath when the data was being analysed to see if this was an issue or not, and then realising, oh my God, even my professor, who's a professor researcher, who I was lumped with when my other professor retired, worst case scenario for a PhD researcher, was shocked. He was a sleep researcher. He goes, no one's talking about this in sleep research, Cole. So it validates what you're doing. Do not underestimate what you're doing with EMFs. Even if you're just throwing out a safe and sound in the middle of a mold audit, checking a bedroom going, wow, it's, 7,000 microwatts, that's a problem. Yeah. All right, so let's get down to business. As many of you know, the college was asked to get involved with becoming a committee member for the first Australian standard in mold, and it's largely going to be very beneficial for our industry when this standard is actually implemented and published, because it provides a minimum duty of care, standard of care for industry to follow. Now, when it comes to Australian standards, they're not legally enforceable. If you look at the hierarchy of legislation, we know an act and regulations are legally enforceable, whereas codes of practice and standards are not. However, in a court of law, when something goes to court like VCAT, as a minimum, they would expect some form of process that you followed to justify why you did what you did. And Australian standard is considered in very high regard. Now, the thing what I like about this standard is essentially it's endorsing the S500, which is for water damage. And just to get clear, a restorer is involved in drying, which should happen in the first 24 to 48 hours, whereas a mold remediator comes after that, once there's microbial growth, after 72 hours, weeks and months down the track. So the remediator and restorer are technically different people, but of course, 90% of the time they have both skill sets, and a remediator must be a restorer, but a restorer doesn't have to be a remediator. So I'm going to go through the changes in the S520, which is the basically the mold remediation document by the IICRC. It was updated this year in 2024 in March. The previous update was in 2015. There haven't been a great many changes, but the changes that were made are going to be good for IEPs, i.e. mold testing technicians, building biologists, because it now puts very clearly that if a remediator deviates from the standard, this Australian standard, they must put in writing to all stakeholders, insurance companies, clients, why they fogged when it goes against the standard. Why didn't they test the building when it goes against the standard? So that must be in writing. So a lot of people are going to continue to not do this because they're not going to be aware when this becomes an Australian standard. There are a lot of duty of care requirements now that if and when it goes to court to set a precedent, that's going to be important. And there are very key words here, in particular, when the client says, I think I've got health problems or I've got asthma, allergies or fatigue syndrome, that immediately escalates the recovery level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the standards, the changes to the S520, and I'm going to then deviate into recovery levels, which is something we talk a lot more in the advanced mold course. So currently we're finishing off the advanced mold course for the first time. The college has offered it as its own separate training. It focuses on post-remediation verification. Brian primarily teaches it. He's done a brilliant job. And essentially we looked at authorities all over the world as to what best practice is for PRVs, because the template reports are very, very different. And the standard of care is actually quite different. We go a lot more into recovery levels. So I want to look at what recovery levels are and when you should be getting involved with the job and what words to use, where the insurance company should actually employ an independent third party to assess the water damage based on several words that the client would use to escalate it away from the remediator. Currently, restorers remediators are doing their own testing, and they are validated to do so if it's a recovery 0 and 1. But as soon as it becomes a 2 and up, that's when an independent third-party assessor should be involved based on the standard of care. So let's get stuck into, I've got a PowerPoint presentation on what the differences are with the new standard.
Oh, do you know when these standards are coming into action? Yeah.
So the S500 should come in around March next year. The S520 has just gone out for opinion. So I'll get that link and get you to send it to the members so that they can have a look at the draft of the S520. So the S500's already been approved. S520's just gone out for feedback from any stakeholders, so including us. And I believe end of January, it will close for feedback, and then it'll go back to the committee to either to implement the feedback or whatever before it's actually enacted. So I reckon the S520 probably looking around mid next year. Yep. All right, so the new S520. So this is the IICRC that came out on in March this year. It does not, so be very clear, it states it does not provide an exhaustive prescriptive list on how to conduct mold remediation. This is sort of a bit like a disclaimer, like here we're going to give you the information, but we're not responsible for it, like so many other legal documents, I've got to say. It doesn't teach how to do the mold remediation. Obviously, they need to do training to do this. IICRC Restoration and Mold course, the AMRT, is 5 days in duration. I do encourage all our building biologists or mold testing technicians to do the IICRC AMRT course, because even though we're not doing the cleaning, you should know what that looks like, what best practice looks like, what does containment look like, all that sort of stuff. So you're using the same language, especially when you're developing a scope of works.
Who's teaching that, Nicole? Just because there's so many people now with Facebook ads claiming that they're teaching remediation.
And look, Jenny, the big problem we have here is that, firstly, people who do the course, not all of them follow the standard. In fact, probably less than half. So the problem is it's not a competency-based course, because you're doing 5 days, you do an online quiz at the end, then you go out, and because you've had no time to consolidate the information and apply that knowledge in the presence of an instructor, it would be illegal for me to do a course like that as an RTO, because it's not a competency-based course, but it's the best course we have in terms of what the principal underpinning knowledge and skills are to do it. So you're absolutely right. People do it and then they don't follow it. So you as an IEP or mold testing technician, building biologist, need to know what's in the S520. All should have a copy. It's not difficult to read. It's not very long. That you know what best practice is, because when the Australian standard becomes enforced, you will have a lot of legal legway, so to speak, to say, well, actually, that's not the standard of care. And theoretically, you should have written that down as into the remediator and to the client saying, you know, you don't have to accept what the insurance company says that person assess your home. Because you've escalated to health, now you can get an independent person involved. So there's massive ramifications for this. The other thing is a lot of remediators, their boss has done the course, but the people cleaning haven't. And that's a big problem. So this is another thing that, look, there's a lot of problems in the industry, but what I like about the fact that it's becoming an Australian standard is it's going to set a benchmark foundational standard that as a minimum everybody should follow. And if they don't, in VCAT, that could go against them. So that's where this is going to be much better for the industry. Okay, you know the IICRC, a lot of people say, I've done the IICRC, I can do testing. No, it doesn't cover testing. So when you read it, you go, there's no testing here. In fact, it says you shouldn't be testing. There are exceptions to that with the PRE, which I'll talk about. For water restoration and drying, obviously that's the S500. The word shall means it's mandatory. So that's important to understand some of the terminology. Should means it's accepted standard of care to be followed, but not mandatory. And recommended is a practice or procedure that's advised or suggested, but not necessarily the standard of care. So when you see shall in the document, it's actually something that it actually is required that is followed. So one of the changes they've made is the definitions to the conditions. Now, conditions is the most important part of the entire document for us, because the condition determines what the scope of works will require. If it's condition 2 or 3, then remediation is warranted. That's the general rule of thumb. So in red is the changes. So condition 1, we know normal fungal ecology and indoor environment that may have settled, or airborne. So they've included airborne now. And of course, you know, in a normal healthy home, you're going to have fungal particulate or structures on an air sample. When I don't see any spores on an air sample, that's not normal. And that's when I often know the remediators had the air purifier or scrubbers on in the process, because that does not reflect a normal fungal ecology. And that's how I can help my clients online when they want a second opinion. I'm looking at the reports, I'm going, that's not normal. Was your air purifier on when they did the testing? Yes, it was. There you go. Null and void. So airborne does have some mold spores and fragments. We all know that's normal. And sometimes it has some hyphae in it, and that is still considered normal. But they've added and constituents like extracellular material, which I'll talk about, hyphae mold fragments, that are reflective of a clean and dry environment. So even the word clean and dry environment has been added to condition 1. Condition 2 has big changes to the definition. It includes surfaces and air. Now, my argument with the industry was that only surfaces are required by tapes to determine condition 2. And I would argue air samples are critical, because the major route of exposure is through breathing. So to assess risk, you have to do air samples. It's critical. And they would say, no, it's not required as condition 2. Well, it is now. So they've stated for condition 2, it can include surfaces and air. So for me, what that meant for the way we teach at the college now is we strongly recommend 1 air and 1 surface sample in every room that you suspect has elevated fungal particulate. Because if the air sample is high in water damaged molds, especially with tertiary colonizers, and the surface sample, which we now teach at the college, should be done on a horizontal high surface that's not normally clean, preferably on a non-porous item like a light fitting or a fan or the top of a cupboard, a fixture. When you have elevated levels of water damaged molds on a surface and an air sample, that is justification that the area is condition 2. Now, I know it brings up a little bit of cost because it's 2 samples in 1 room, but what we're finding is it's very closely mapping with adverse health effects, because of course I test the entire house now, roof, subfloor, everything. And over the last few years, I'm noticing that when it comes to health effects, because I'm mapping this, is that the spore count is the least important, whereas the rank order is the most important. And having spoken to Joe Spurgeon and other experts in this field in the US, rank order will always surpass, because most of the industry are saying if it's below 1,000 spores, fungal structures per cubic meter of air, it's okay. That's not okay. Spore count is the least important. You need to look at it, but it's not the most important. For an air sample, rank order is critical. So what's become apparent is when we're looking at outdoor samples, they are a pain in the ass, because you can get 10,000, like the last one was 15,000, in Sydney, of spore counts. When we looked at the rank order, it was all ascospores and basidiospores. But inside the house, the rank order in the kitchen was Aspergillus, Cladosporium, Chaetomium, etc. In the bedrooms, Aspergillus. The whole house rank order was Aspen was the highest spore count. That rank order is already indicative that there is a problem in those rooms. So I've really tightened up the interpretation and put a lot more lectures now into how to interpret lab results based on rank order, based on spore counts compared to the Australian Mold Guideline is the fourth most important. The presence of tertiary colonizers is more important than spore counts, etc. And it seems to be mapping very closely with what the client's saying about adverse health effects in the exposure history. So at some point, I'd like to publish that and start accruing more of that data. We will talk a lot more about interpretation of lab results in the advanced course, because I think it'd be good to get on the same page as to how we interpret this, because the industry will fight it, insurance will fight it, and they'll go, if it's below 1,000, I don't want to know about it. And so, well, that's not okay. So in condition 2 is indoor environment, including surfaces and air, which is contaminated with residual mold biomass. So they've changed the term here from a known condition 3 source in that same indoor environment. So they're saying that there's microbial growth happening in one area due to moisture, and that's cross-contaminating that room or adjacent rooms from, airflow, for example. So condition 2 is basically cross-contamination. When you start mapping, especially Aspergillus penicillium in the house, it's probably one of the most important signifying of all the water damage molds, because you will see Aspen is present in every water damaged building, every single one of them, except a contaminated split system, it's mainly clado. But you will find when you start mapping the spore counts in each room, you can see clearly most of the time the microbial growth is happening here and it's cross-contaminating as it's having a diluting effect away from that area. So to me, I strongly encourage students now to put the spore counts, especially for tertiary colonizers and Aspen, on the floor plan and look at the spore counts so you can see whether it's cross-contamination is what you're picking up in the room as opposed to where the growth is actually occurring. So this includes spores, fragments, filaments, extracellular material from sporulation, sloughing and production, and now they've added mycotoxins and microbial VOCs to this list. So I'll talk about mycotoxins because the S520 now indicates that the physical removal of fungal particulate is sufficient to remove mycotoxins from the environment. So in the absence of an IEP, the contractor may assume or confirm the presence of condition 2 with full disclosure to the client and reference, there are caveats to this, for the placement of containment areas to be contained. So there are scenarios where the remediator restorer can confirm the presence of condition 2 with full disclosure to the client to state that, and I'll go into what that means. So condition 3's actual mold growth hasn't changed definition much, except they've included dead and non-viable, and they've taken out a few words of the definition, but essentially an environment contaminated with the presence of mold growth that is active, dormant, dead, non-viable. So people would think only if the mold's growing. Consumers think, the public thinks, kill the mold, kill the mold. Well, actually, if it's got dead or non-viable, it still can be condition 3. And we all know this, because if it's in the problem with a lot of the mold in people's homes is that it's episodic moisture problems. More often than not, my moisture readings are unremarkable, they're dry, but I can see massive visible mold because it's not growing because they have episodic moisture problems like water vapor issues. So I'm glad to see they've added dead and non-viable because it justifies that condition 3 doesn't necessarily have to be in the growth stage. Remediation. So the changes are identify the ability to successfully remediate mycotoxins following the same procedures with the standards. So because people are talking more about mycotoxins, now I want to make it very clear, most mycotoxins in someone's body is due to their diet. Grains, coffee, and I can tell you right now, I'm never going to quit coffee, so they can shove it up their ass. I don't care how many mycotoxins are on it. But if clients have SIRS, more often than not, they're going to have to stop grains because they've got traffic jams in their liver, and their capacity to deal with more mycotoxins is just they're overloaded. The burden is overloaded. So, but mycotoxins mainly come from food. They do come from water damage environments, but unless you're doing viable sampling to check for trichothecenes, etc., then it's difficult to map. A lot of the most experienced doctors in mold are moving away from testing mycotoxins in people's urine because it's expensive, and as long as they've got the symptoms, it's pretty indicative that they've probably got SIRS. So why spend $2,000 to confirm that when they can focus on remediating their home? So in the standard, it says mycotoxins can be effectively remediated and overall concentrations greatly reduced by using the same process and methods used for condition 3 growth and condition 2 fungal particulate. So they're saying mycotoxins can be addressed that way, because you're going to find a lot of remediators coming going, I've got a special technique to get rid of mycotoxins, and you don't physically remove the mold to get mycotoxins, you do this. Well, what this standard is saying is the physical removal of fungal particulate is sufficient and adequate to deal with mycotoxins. The use of biocides, enzymes, UV radiation, ionizers, oxidation, hydroxyl ions are known to sufficiently denature reactive functional groups or destroy molecular structure of mycotoxins is generally not recommended. I forgot to add that to the sentence, is not recommended. More emphasis is being placed on remediators to discourage them from spraying mold, fogging. The focus is very clearly now, you must physically remove. Anything else you do is secondary, but unless you physically remove the fungal particulate and clean the surface, then you are not following the standard of care. So that is the primary role a remediator must do. Everything else, fogging, essential oils, whatever, is considered to be not effective. Might be an extra thing the remediator does, especially if it's hard to get to areas and confined spaces to use hydroxyl ions, but the primary focus must be physically removing the mold. And of course, we all know that. This should be verified with a PRE or PRV. And I'll talk about what that is in a moment.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, what's a PRE?
I'm going to go through that.
Sorry.
Remediation, less emphasis on the use of biocides, attempts to kill, encapsulate, or inhibit mold instead of proper source removal is a deviation from the standard of care, and stakeholders should be notified in writing of such. That is big. What it's saying in the new S520 is if you fog and you don't physically remove, you are required to tell the client that this is not what the standard of care is, that you have deviated from the standard of care. I can tell you no one's going to do that until it goes to court. Once it goes to court, it's going to set a precedent. So this document is saying if they're fogging and they're not doing anything else, they are required to put into writing to the insurer, to the client, that they have deviated from the standard of care. That is a requirement now as part of this. And when it becomes an Australian standard, maybe not so much when it's the S520 now, but as an Australian standard, it's going to have a lot more weight to say in court, why didn't you do this? Australian standard, you were required to notify them in writing why you deviated from this standard. So I think this is good. Remediators should not use disinfectant fungicides instead of removing it. Stain removers before or instead of cleaning the growth. So you can use a stain remover, but make sure you physically remove the fungal particulate first. Yeah. If you're going to use chemical products, it can't be the primary way of dealing with the mold. You have to physically remove the mold. If you want to use chemicals and waste your money, fair enough. But if you didn't physically remove it, then you're deviating from the standard of care, essentially is what the standard is now saying. Any product or device to deliver a gas or vapor intended to kill microbes without prior cleaning. So they're stating very clean now they should not use this as the primary way of cleaning. So now our turn assessment. What does it say? When an entire building or system is fully involved as a result of condition 3 mold contamination, or when the scope of work can be determined without sampling or independent IEP inspection assessment, engagement of an IEP for assessment may not be necessary. Now, when I was in the committee, I went, no, this is ridiculous. That's ridiculous. And I said, no, Cole, what we mean is if your house has been impacted by a cyclone or a tree and you've got water gushing in and it's so obvious the whole house has been flooded or storm damage or a cyclone coming through your house, it's so obvious, why would you get an IEP to test it when the whole thing's contaminated? So that's what this section of the S520 means, that you don't need to get an independent third party when, with all those flood issues in, all over Queensland that happened, a couple of years ago, you don't need an IEP to verify this house is completely, impacted. So that's what this part of the standard means. When a preliminary determination indicates that mold contamination exists or is likely to exist, or if confirmation of condition is requested by the client, an assessment should be performed prior to starting the remediation. So basically, they're sort of saying, you are required to test if you suspect that there's condition 2 or 3. Now, the challenge I have with this is that most of the houses I'm testing that are the worst case scenario, I can't even see or smell mold. So how do you know without testing? That's the problem. You don't know. I have found the exposure history to be the most reliable marker for potential adverse health effects in a home, without a shadow of a doubt. If clients develop asthma, allergies, or chronic fatigue syndrome after a bathroom renovation within 3 months, of a water event, etc., 99% of the time, it's often, elevated. So this is the challenge that, if mold contamination exists, how do you know without sampling? You don't. If it's likely to exist, well, without sampling, you don't know. Or if the client confirms, if confirmation of the condition is requested, this is where the client can then ask for an independent assessment. So clients having a certain language to understand their rights is going to be important. And the big one is, as soon as your client raises health issues, an independent mold testing technician must be appointed. The remediator is not actually allowed to test based on the standard of care. So that's really important. And let's face it, that's why we're in there most of the time, because clients have got alleged health issues, which is what we're investigating in the house. So as soon as they have health issues and they make the remediator aware of that, that's when an independent IEP must actually be engaged. So that's a difference now. If the remediator is asked about health concern, they are required to refer them on to an appropriate healthcare practitioner. The challenge and laughable thing is what healthcare practitioner, because most have no idea. And that's where your knowledge of ACNM and integrative clinicians and naturopaths who specialise in this becomes really important. So a remediator has a duty of care to refer them on to a healthcare practitioner. The reality is they're not learning this in the IICRC course. So it's going to be interesting how that unfolds. So more emphasis on the importance and use of proper communication. So in the new standard, they're saying that they have to put in writing a lot of this to the client, to all stakeholders. Any deviation to the standard of care must be put in writing by the remediator, assuming condition 2, and especially if they have a conflict with the IEP or mold testing technician. Yeah. All deviations require written justification to all parties. That's big. I think a lot of remediators at the moment will have no idea what their obligations are when the Australian standard becomes enforced. So what's PRE or PRV? A firm clearance criterion for post-remediation and evaluation. So the new S520 has a lot more guidance on post-remediation evaluation. I'll talk about what that is. A PRE is something that a remediator can do. And generally this is important because it saves costs. When the remediators in the remediation process, they're testing at the same time going, oh yeah, there is more contamination there, so we have to do more remediation, before they get the independent mold testing technician, building biologist, to do the PRV. So it's normal that a mold remediator will do some testing in the process of remediation to verify their own work. IEPs, or mold testing technicians, building biologists, perform post-remediation verification. So PRVs are different to PREs. PRVs, and I'm going to differentiate now. So now I'm deviating from what the S520 is, and I'm going to go into detail of the advanced mold course where we talk about recovery levels. If the IEP, mold testing technician, building biologist, conducting the assessment or PRV is not independent from the remediator, they should disclose in writing to the client that they are deviating from the standard. So remediators who are bringing in people who are employed by their own company, the client, it must be disclosed in writing to the client that they're deviating from the standard. That's huge. So this is where you can inform your client what their rights are. All right, so let's look at what's a PRE. Post-remediation evaluation is a low form of validation performed by the restorer or remediator to validate their own work. It relates to recovery level 0 and 1. It's conducted by the restorer and remediator. Post-remediation verification is a higher form of validation performed by an independent third-party mold testing technician, building biologist, and relates to recovery level 2 to 4. I'm going to go into detail. So what I'm going into now is not in the S520, it's in the advanced mold course, where we're looking at what are the recovery levels for post-remediation verification and evaluation. So where does the remediator come in? That's valid. And where does an independent third party, you, come in? So recovery level is basically for very small amounts of water damage in non-critical environments where the report is very brief. And what we're doing in the advanced mold course is your reports are very, very small, which you're going to love. Lots of tables, but much, much more. It's like a third of the size of your pre-remediation testing. The report is brief and may not include all the data and images that are required, so it's very, very brief. The engagement of an independent consultant is not required to satisfy a PRE. The PRE recovery level 0 means there's no health risk. The clients have not stated any health risks in this building. The damage is in a non-occupied space. The water damage has been limited. The conditions for mold growth have been unfavourable but are dealt with, and rapid drying was implemented, which means it probably didn't get into a mold remediation related issue. So basically it was dried in a timely manner. There's no health risks that reported by the client, so the remediator can actually test their own work through what we call a PRE. Recovery level 1 is also a more advanced form of PRE that is conducted by the restorer, remediator. So a small to medium-sized area of physical damage and microbial contamination where there's no reporting of health concerns by the client. It requires more documentation by the restorer, but it's less expensive because, of course, when they bring us involved, costs start to escalate. So it helps to reduce the cost to the client. The microbial contamination is limited to a small to medium area, and the affected area has been returned to its pre-loss condition. So this is where the restorer or remediator can test their own work and are not required to have an independent third-party mold testing technician. Recovery level 2, however, is different. This is where there's an escalation and where there is a health concern. When there's a health concern, the client has the right to get an independent third party to test the building. They don't have to go with who the insurance wants. They don't have to go with who the remediator wants. They will go with an independent third party that's separate to the restorer remediator. This is normally a larger area of damage or contamination that impacts multiple zones or rooms. The area of water damage or contamination is often greater than 10 square metres. There are health concerns related to microbial contamination. So it doesn't have to be all these issues. It can be one of them, and one of them could be client has asthma, allergies, recurrent colds and flus that seem to have occurred since being after the water event, since the bathroom reno, since moving into a water damaged home. That becomes automatically recovery level 2. Bacterial or fungi. So if there's a category 2 or 3 where there's bacterial contamination, E. coli, grey water, black water, then that also escalates it to a recovery level 2. Recovery level 3, recovery level 2 onwards requires an independent third-party assessor such as yourself. where there are known and or medically diagnosed vulnerable occupants. So here, the client isn't alleging, I think I've got health problems from mold. This one's saying, I've actually been diagnosed with asthma. I've been diagnosed with pneumonia. I've been diagnosed with SIRS. So they've a medical diagnosis. Containment and environment controls are necessary. Sampling strategies with greater statistical subjectivity. So basically you're sampling a lot more. You're sampling for areas impacted as well as adjacent areas for cross-contamination. This is more like what I taught you to do from the beginning with pre-remediation testing, is to, to do this testing. But in hindsight, I didn't know about these recovery levels prior to learning all about that recently in the advanced course. So this is actually, a recovery level 3 is more like what a building biologist does pre-remediation testing in many ways. Recovery level 4 is for people who have very compromised products, assets, or persons. It's not something building biologists would get involved in because it's normally government buildings, hospital, laboratories, clean labs, where they've got very expensive multi-million-dollar assets, where the data reporting is critical, where they've got their own process as to, like normally you'll find when a remediator is involved with the recovery level 4, that multi-million-dollar organization is going to tell them, this is our process and this is what you're going to follow, which is going to be far greater than a lot of what they've been taught in their course. So basically, it generally involves critical facilities, like I mentioned, for recovery level 4. They're often tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars job from your perspective. So the highest level of PRV is required for those types of jobs. Yeah. So that's recovery level 4. So that isn't discussed in the S520, but what is discussed in the S520 is PRE and PRV. So in the advanced mold course, we actually differentiate when does the restorer remediator come in and when does a third-party independent person like yourself actually come in. And the main one is health effects and the level of water damage that actually occurred when microbial growth is present. So in terms of the Australian standard, basically it's adopting and modifying the IICRC S500 and S520. As I mentioned, S500 has already been endorsed and will become, I think, February, March. And the S520 has gone out for peer review. I'll find that link and get Cal to send it to all of you if you want to have a look at it. And the only modification in the S520 is the language. So mould is MOULD. The Australian English spelling has changed. We've nominated organisations, including the college, which is listed on there. And of course, when it came to work health and safety, in the old S520, it went into detail how to make sure it was a work safe environment. We've deleted all of that. Or upon my recommendations, we delete all of that. And I said, look, Work Health and Safety Act 2011 and all the jurisdictions, state and territory jurisdictions are very prescriptive. Why would we rewrite that? So encourage the committee to just make it simple and go, follow your state and territory, the Work Health and Safety Act and state and territory obligations, and then list them, Safe Work Australia, for all of these different states and territories. So that's changed in that part of the S520. So it looks something like this, AS-IICRC S520, it'll probably be 2024. Yeah. Okay, so just finishing up, advanced mold testing, as I said, we've gone through it once, so thanks to all of the guinea pigs that went through. But essentially, there are 3 trainers, Brian, Don, and David. Brian is the primary teacher. It's been quite interesting learning a lot of, how post-remediation verification works. It's quite different to pre-remediation testing, and it's a lot simpler in terms of the reporting, but there are multiple stakeholders involved. So you need to consider that. Recovery levels is important. We learn how to do bacterial category 3 sampling. Insurance, so David King talks a lot more about what your clients' requirements are and when, what happens at arbitration, etc., and how to read a policy. Probably the best thing I learned about those lectures was, for God's sake, Cole, make sure you've got accidental cover. If you've got accidental cover ticked, they normally will not dispute it and you'll generally find claims will go through. If you don't, that's where, you know, the cheapest insurance companies, and I won't list them until the recording's off, he said don't go with, because they often don't honour their claims. So you're paying all this money, and then when the water event happens, good luck trying to get any money out of the insurance company. So that was a real eye-opener. Concrete moisture testing is very complicated, and probably the most important thing for me to say in this whole lecture is, which I now teach to all my mold testing students in the past 2 years, is, for goodness sake, make sure in your disclaimer that you do not say the concrete is dry. Or your scan concrete moisture meter, and Trimix has probably got the best one, only goes in 1 inch, 2 centimeters, 15 mils to 2 centimeters max. So if the slab is greater than that, what Don was saying, Don is an expert, flooring expert, has been in the industry, second generation, been in the industry for more than 20 years. And he is involved in multi-million-dollar lawsuits against restorers, remediators, and a lot of it comes back down to this one thing, that they're saying the concrete is dry. Well, we now realise our scan meters only go in 1 inch. So therefore, you cannot say with certainty the concrete's dry. Please don't say that. What you're saying is, I can only measure the first 2 centimetres. And what Dom was saying is, in a water event, all the water seeps to the bottom of the concrete. So when a remediator comes in and dries, it dries from the top down, and your scan meter's going, it's dry. But weeks later, that moisture is wicking up through the concrete, and now that floor is failing, whatever floor's on top, because it's got moisture that's risen to the top, which taken weeks or months to do. They've come in and now it's gone to court. So I'm telling all my mold testing students, make sure in your disclaimer that you state, I am unable to determine if the concrete is dry beyond 2 centimetres, so I refer you on to blah, 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 to check that the slab is dry. Otherwise, you could be liable. So we go through all the different Australian standards. I only paid Don $5,000 for 3 hours of lectures to show you how to test for concrete with the sleeve, the AS-2180, 2170 standard. So there's 3 different Australian standards for testing. They're the only ones that will hold up in a court of law, and your scan meters will not. So we'll talk we'll spend a week just talking about that. You've got videos, I've taped him showing you how to do it. It's not difficult, but you've got to follow the process. From watching those lectures, from now on, I say in my reports, I cannot verify that this concrete slab is dry, and I suggest I refer you on to this person instead. Cal, what did you think of those lectures on concrete?
Yes, very good, very eye-opening and clear.
Would you do that testing that he does, sleeve testing, drilling into concrete?
Not at this stage, no.
Nah.
No.
No way. I mean, you can do it, but yeah. So I think it's important to be clear about our limitations to prevent you being litigated. So this is really important for you to know, because concrete dries from the top down. Most concrete, if it's wet, is wet from the bottom up, and it takes weeks to migrate. So they were very interesting lectures by Dom. And PRV reporting is a very simple 10, 15-page document, mainly a few tables. That's it. That an insurance company will encourage. And lab interpretation will do a lot more of that. So any more information, you can see the website. Next one starts 12th of Feb, and there's a 10% discount if you're listening to this. And it's quite eye-opening, I've got to say. So welcome to the new S520 and the new Australian standard that will be coming out. I think it'll be good for our industry.
Nicole, that was great. Any questions?
One, we keep talking about results and stuff. I was just wondering whether part of the standard, you know how they talk about having 1,000 spores or less than 500.
They don't say that
water.
instead. There's no
Sorry?
stand. You mean the Australian mold guideline? Because the S520 don't talk about how to test water damaged buildings, and they don't provide any exposure standards.
Yeah, I know. So that's what I'm saying. We had a conversation the other day about the fact that it's only a standard or it's only a suggested amount of mold allowable in a room. It's like, So is there any more concrete placing on that?
No. And that's why I've spent a lot more time in the mold course and the advanced mold course going through case studies of how to interpret lab results based on rank order. So, and this is something that's not listed in anywhere in terms of how to do this, which is why I've spent so much time and giving lots and lots of case studies, comparing the exposure history with client health issues, and then looking at what's going on, where I'm saying to the client, and it's happened, this house isn't a problem, your cat's a problem. Everyone knows I carry on about cats. I'm finding 5% of my clients are reacting to their pets. Now, as a building biologist, I strongly recommend and encourage you. It's so easy to get stuck into mold because your client's going, it's mold, it's mold. You're going in there, please make sure you've got an incredible skill set that's not just mold, it's EMFs. It could be cat. I see the cat there, and the first thing I ask is, or a dog, your symptoms are identical to allergies. So have you been tested, or your kid's been tested? No. 80% of the time when they get tested, they're allergic to the animal and they didn't know. And I see the mold levels okay, slightly elevated, but not justification for their symptoms. It's often, not often, but occasionally it's the furry pets. So I strongly recommend all of you have a skill set that most of your clients are not utilizing. They don't know how much you can help them. So I think it's important to remember when you're doing an assessment, don't just think it's mold. There are many house dust mites and pet allergies can cause very similar symptoms to mold. Asthma, allergies, recurrent colds and flus, hay fever. In fact, it's more likely to cause allergies than even mold. So I think it's important to keep your multiple hats on. Don't assume it's always mold. I think that's why I like the rank order, because it helps me go, if the rank order of spores, ascospores, basidiospores, cladosporium in the outdoors is the same as the rank order in a room, that room's condition 1. And I generally find this is becoming a lot clearer to me over the years. So to me, rank order is far superior to spore counts. The industry looks at spore counts. I don't think it's a good idea because they don't look at risk. They don't look at susceptible individuals. Our focus is on susceptible individuals, and that's how you assess risk. And this is my argument in the industry. They're saying, Cole, you shouldn't be looking at health. No, when I wrote this course, you are classified as a health practitioner, but we don't diagnose. You understand what hazards cause what health problems. That's what I trained you to do with your exposure history. So I think we're in a very unique position specifically for immunocompromised individuals, susceptible individuals, children, whereas no one else in the industry is trained like that. So to me, rank order becomes critical. When I look at outdoor counts, I always do 2. And I find the spore counts in the backyard, front yard, completely different. Aspen spore counts completely different. But the percentage of aspen on the slide is almost identical in the outdoor samples. And the rank order is nearly always the same. 99% of the time it's the same. So it doesn't matter what the spore counts are in the outdoor sample, especially when you're doing it in Sydney and it's 20,000 outdoor spore count. If the rank order inside the room is different to the outdoors, you probably have a problem, because you'll generally find aspen will be elevated, and in the outdoor aspen either doesn't exist or it's only at 5% or 10% max. So to me, rank order becomes utterly critical, and it seems to be mapping very beautifully with the symptoms I'm seeing in my clients. Yeah. But industry, they only go on spore counts, and I think this is not the way to go. Spore counts is the 4th important, 4th on the list. It's not the 1st, certainly not the 2nd. Tertiary colonizers come after that, and hyphae. Yeah. All right, just carry on like a pork chop. I think I'll end it there.
Cole, any more questions?